Growing churches have the responsibility of protecting the hearing of anywhere from 250 to 250,000 listeners on a Sunday. That's a ton of ears. That's like 500,000 ears. And we do that by measuring loudness. We have this unit called the decibel, but do you have any idea what a decibel is? What makes 1 decibel? Today we're gonna dive right into it, and we're gonna start by taking it from the very tippy top. Here we are at the tippy top, asking ourselves, what is a sound? Sound happens when the air vibrates. We detect these vibrations with our ears. If I snap my fingers, it only vibrates the air a little bit, whereas if I slam my car door shut, it vibrates the air a whole lot. These vibrations travel out in every direction from the source of the sound. Now, if we pick just one of those directions and track the vibration as it travels, we could kind of draw it as a wave shape. Our ears are pretty sensitive to pressure. In fact, our ears are so sensitive that just the amount of air sitting on our ears changes the way we perceive the world around us. When a sound makes the air vibrate against our ears, it adds some extra pressure. We're a creative bunch when it comes to naming things, so we call this extra pressure generated by sounds sound pressure. If we are exposed to too much sound pressure, our ears start to hurt, or in some serious cases, they'll literally vibrate themselves apart and tear on the inside. Because of this, it is in our best interest to have some way of measuring how much sound pressure we're being exposed to. So how do we do that? Luckily, we're not the first people to ask. Let's go back in time. Somewhere between Jesus and the convertible, a fellow named Alexander Graham Bell needed to measure sound pressure so he could invent the telephone, sorta. Before he could apply his work to sound, he needed a scientific way to talk about pressure in general. Luckily, before him, a fellow named Blaze once missed his calling as a campfire and instead devoted himself to science, creating a unit for measuring pressure which took on his own last name, the Pascal. It's not really relevant to break this down any further than Pascal's work. Just remember that a Pascal is 1 standard amount of pressure. Alexander Graham Bell learned that our ears can detect incredibly small changes in pressure, like 20 micropascals of pressure. At the same time, depending on the person, our ears can handle anywhere from 20 to 200 pascals of pressure before we experience pain or permanent damage. Trying to plot this scale is really difficult because it's really hard to count numbers with lots of decimal points. Just to get from 0 to 1 on this scale, we need to increment through more than 100,000 different numbers. 0.4, 0.00005, 0.00006, 0.00007. Alexander Graham Bell did not want to count for several years at a time, so he used some math tools to effectively compress the scale down to 12 units. He vainly named this system after himself, the bell. I'm going to tell you the math formula now, but you will never need it again as long as you remember everything else I tell you in this video. 1 bell is the same as taking the logarithm of one value compared to another value. Math folks write it out like this: 1 bell equals the log of P1 over P2. What's actually happening here is we're measuring how big things are compared to other things, instead of counting the whole way up to them. 1 bell of something is 10 times larger than the reference value. 2 bells is 10 times larger than that, or 100 times your reference value. Here's a practical example. Let's say we want to count round cereals by a popular brand who doesn't sponsor me. We'll call them Gladios. If I count these one step at a time, it will take me so long to get to the end of a box of Gladios. Instead, we can count them using bells. Here we have 1 Gladio, which will be our reference point. 1 bell is 10 times more than that, so it would be 10 Gladios. If I increase it by a second bell, so 10 times as many again, it becomes 100 Gladios. 3 bells would be 1,000 Gladios, and 4 bells would be 10,000 Gladios. What's important here is our reference point. If I referenced 2 Gladios instead of 1, then 1 bell of Gladios would be 20 instead of 10, because really 1 bell just means 10 times more than our reference point. In sound pressure, our reference point is 20 micropascals. We also call this the threshold of human hearing because it's the amount of pressure where our ear begins to notice. We also know how much pressure it takes to hurt our ears, which we call the threshold of pain at 12 bells of sound pressure. 1 to 12 is certainly an easier scale to use than 0.0000002 the whole way up to 120,000 and so on. But it's not a perfect scale. It doesn't give us the ability to measure fine details. Let's say we're going to measure size. We'll use a speck of dirt as our reference point. A bug would be about 10 times bigger than the speck of dirt, so we could say a bug is 1 dirt bell. By the time we get to 12 dirt bells of size, we're dealing with something about the size of the sun. Now, on a scale from a bug to the sun, where would you put a pebble? A pebble is certainly bigger than a bug, but it's not 10 times bigger than a bug. So is the pebble also 1 bell? And if it is, what good is this unit anyway? It doesn't give us any specific details. Graham Bell recognized this, so he subdivided his new unit, the bell, into 10 equal pieces, called decibels. Now there are 10 steps between each bell, so instead of a scale from 1 to 12, it's a scale from 10 to 120. Now we're cooking with fire. See, now we can be a little bit more specific without having to be 8 decimal points specific. Back to our visualization. 1 bell is the same as 10 decibels, so let's call our bug 10 decibels instead of 1 bell of dirt size. On this finer scale, we have a place for a pebble. It's about 13 decibels of size. Remember how 1 bell SPL was the threshold of human hearing, and how 12 bells SPL was the threshold of pain? Well, we could change those to be 10 decibels SPL as the threshold of hearing, and 120 decibels SPL as the threshold of pain. Now all we need is a noise meter, and then as long as we keep it above 10 decibels and below 120 decibels, we should be all right?
Yeah.
Decibel sound pressure level give us a great tool for measuring the objective pressure in the air. The issue is that our hearing is subjective. Sound pressure is objective. How much air is vibrating? Loudness is subjective. How loud does it feel to you? In order to science our way through this, we need a couple more factors than just the amount of sound pressure in the air. We need to talk about frequency, we need to talk about the way our ears hear. We know that all sound travels in waves, but not all waves are created equal. We differentiate these waves using a term called frequency. Frequency is measured in hertz, and hertz just means how many of something in a second. If you look really closely at a sound wave, you'll see that it's just one shape that repeats itself over and over and over again. That one shape we call one cycle. So the measurement in hertz is how many of that cycle appears in 1 second. Something that vibrates faster is going to create more of those cycles in a second than something that's vibrating slower. So we would say that subject has a higher frequency. Our ears are also able to discern the difference between different frequencies of sound. It's one of the ways that we're able to tell different sound sources apart even when they're making noise at the same time. For example, have you ever listened to a drum kit? You're able to differentiate when the drummer is hitting the cymbals versus when the drummer is hitting the snare versus when the drummer is hitting the kick drum. We're more sensitive to certain frequencies and less sensitive to other frequencies. For example, 80 decibels of sound pressure at 1000 hertz will feel pretty dang loud to us, but 80 decibels of sound pressure at 120 hertz will feel barely noticeable. This means different sounds will cause us pain at different levels, so we can't have just one standard threshold of pain for human hearing. Luckily, science gave us Fletcher and Munson. Fletcher and Munson discovered that how sensitive our ears are doesn't just depend on the frequency of sound, but also the amount of pressure at that frequency. At higher sound pressures, our ears become more sensitive to low frequencies, but at lower sound pressures, our ears are not nearly as sensitive to those frequencies, so we may not even notice their presence. This translation they called weighting the frequencies, assigning more weight to frequencies that we're more sensitive to and less weight to frequencies we're less sensitive to. They developed 3 different weightings to accommodate for how we hear sound as the sound pressure increases: an A weighting, a B weighting, and a C weighting. A and C are the most common, and most sound meters will let you read both. A weighting is far more effective for lower frequencies because it discounts most of the low-end content of the sound. That is, most of the low frequencies it doesn't even bother measuring when it measures the amount of sound pressure in the room. Anything over about 80 decibels of sound pressure, we get a more accurate reading using the C weighting because this does take into account those low frequencies, which at the higher pressure levels our ears are much more attuned to, and they all add up to determine how much pain we might or might not perceive. How loud is too loud still depends on the person, but we do have several conservative standards that we use to try and make sure we don't damage anybody's hearing. Even though C weighting is more accurate for a musical environment, because C weighting accommodates for those low-end bass frequencies, and most music has some of those, A weighting is what's commonly used in the noise exposure safety standards because most other industries don't have a whole lot of low-end frequencies, for example, construction machinery. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health has set the standard that 91 decibels A-weighted is safe for about 2 hours of continuous exposure. Any longer than that and we begin to feel pain. For every 3 decibels, as measured on an A-weighted scale, that we increase our sound, our listening time decreases by half. So if at 91 we can listen for 2 hours, then at 93 dBA we can listen for 1 hour. At 96, it's safe to listen for 30 minutes. At 99, it's safe to listen for 15 minutes. At 102, it's safe to listen for 7 minutes, and then you're already experiencing hearing damage. And the more of that you take, the more likely it is to become permanent.
But Josh, you
said 120 decibels of sound pressure was the threshold of pain, and it is, but that's instantaneous. 120 decibels of pressure will immediately cause you hearing damage. However, prolonged exposure to those lower levels can still cause you hearing damage. Because the A weighting scale used to set our standards does not accommodate for bass frequencies as effectively as the C weighting scale does, C weighted readings will always tend to come out higher than A weighted readings. Because of this, I recommend that you use a C weighted reading but follow A weighted standards. This will make sure your decisions take even the most sensitive listeners into account. One day we're going to talk about noise protection, we're going to talk about the utility of your Apple Watch, we're going to talk about where to put a decibel meter to get the best reading in the room, all those kinds of things. If that video's come out, it's going to be linked right over here. If not, you can subscribe down here in order to make sure you don't miss it when it does come out. Until next time, stay safe out there, and don't forget to wash the grill of your microphones. I mean, come on, those things are going to smell like butt if you don't put some Listerine on there. Peace.